Jacob Reed, the ambitious CEO of a growing restaurant chain, prided himself on maintaining excellent service standards across all his establishments. However, recent complaints about one of his branches had become too frequent to ignore. Customers mentioned slow service, unprofessional staff, and an unpleasant dining experience. Jacob knew that relying solely on reports from his managers wouldn't give him the full picture. He needed to see it with his own eyes. One evening, instead of arriving in a sharp suit with an entourage, he chose a simple disguise, a casual hoodie, jeans, and a baseball cap. Looking like any other customer, he walked into the restaurant unnoticed. As soon as he stepped inside, a wave of tension hit him. The atmosphere lacked the warmth and professionalism he expected. Customers sat at their tables with frustrated expressions, some glancing at their watches impatiently. A few even muttered complaints under their breath. Jacob took a seat in the corner, blending into the background as he observed the chaos unfolding before him. The wait staff hurried from table to table, their faces strained with exhaustion. One waitress in particular, Megan, seemed overwhelmed. She juggled multiple orders, apologizing repeatedly to irritated customers. Despite her best efforts, her stress was evident in the way her hands trembled slightly as she carried the trays. Meanwhile, the restaurant manager, Rick, stood near the counter with his arms crossed, barking orders rather than offering help. His voice was sharp, filled with impatience, but instead of motivating the staff, it only seemed to increase their anxiety. Jacob's jaw tightened as he watched Rick dismiss a customer complaint with an insincere nod before turning his back. Jacob's anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. This wasn't just a case of overworked employees, it was a leadership failure. He could see that the staff wasn't lazy, they were struggling under poor management. If the employees had proper support, they wouldn't be drowning in stress like this. Determined to uncover the full truth, Jacob decided to extend his visit. He observed interactions, noted mistakes, and paid close attention to how Rick handled problems, or rather, how he avoided them. This was no longer just a routine inspection. It was a mission. By the end of the night, Jacob had seen enough. He had come in expecting to identify minor service issues, but what he found was a toxic work environment. As he left the restaurant, his mind was already forming a plan. Tomorrow, he wouldn't be returning as an anonymous customer. He would be returning as the CEO, and changes were coming. Jacob Reed, the sharp-eyed CEO of a successful restaurant chain, prided himself on running a company where employees felt valued. He believed that a happy, motivated team was the backbone of any thriving business. But lately, troubling reports had reached his ears, complaints about one particular branch where staff morale was plummeting. High turnover, poor service, and whispered grievances hinted at a serious problem. Determined to get to the truth, Jacob decided to investigate personally. He ditched his usual tailored suit for a simple outfit, jeans, a plain button-up shirt, and a cap to partially conceal his face. That evening, he stepped into the restaurant as just another customer, unnoticed by the busy staff. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary. The dining area was clean, the menu well organized, and the staff moved quickly. But as Jacob settled into his seat and observed, he began to notice the cracks beneath the surface. The employees were not just busy, they were frantic. Their smiles were strained, their movements rushed, and their eyes darted nervously toward the kitchen. A young waitress, Megan, caught his attention. She was juggling multiple orders, her hands shaking slightly as she placed a plate on a table. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Are you blind? That order was supposed to go to table 5, not 3. Jacob turned to see the restaurant manager, Rick, glaring at Megan. Her face paled as she stammered an apology, but Rick wasn't interested in explanations. He waved her off dismissively and muttered something under his breath before storming back toward the counter. Megan took a deep breath, blinking rapidly, as if holding back tears, before forcing herself to continue her work. Jacob's jaw tightened. As the night went on, he noticed more alarming details. Employees were being pushed to their limits, rushing between tables, barely catching their breath, all while under constant scrutiny. Every small mistake was met with scorn rather than guidance. One waiter, who accidentally dropped a glass, was forced to clean up while enduring a harsh lecture in front of customers. Another was denied a break despite looking visibly exhausted. It wasn't just strict management, it was outright oppression. Jacob clenched his fists beneath the table. His heart pounded with frustration as he watched his employees shrink under Rick's rule. How long had this been happening? How many good workers had been driven away by this mistreatment? By the time he finished his meal, his decision was made. Tonight, he had walked in as a customer. Tomorrow, he would return as their CEO. And when he did, things were going to change. Jacob Reed sat in the dimly lit corner of the restaurant, his cap pulled low over his eyes. He blended into the background like any other late-night customer, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly as he observed the movements of his employees. His heart was heavy with suspicion. For weeks, he had received anonymous complaints about mistreatment under his restaurant manager, Rick. Employees quitting without warning, shifts extending beyond scheduled hours, and an overall sense of fear gripping the workplace. Jacob needed to see it for himself. The restaurant bustled with activity, but something felt off. The smiles on his employees' faces were strained, their postures tense as they moved about in hurried, almost anxious motions. He noticed a waitress, Megan, flinch when Rick walked past, her shoulders stiffening as if bracing for something. Jacob clenched his jaw. He had built his company from the ground up with the belief that employees deserved respect. If those values were being violated under his own roof, he had to put an end to it. As he sat in silence, his sharp ears picked up a hushed conversation coming from near the storage room. Megan was speaking in a low, desperate tone to another employee, a young man from the kitchen staff. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice thick with frustration and exhaustion. "Rick keeps cutting our breaks, forcing us to stay late without pay. And if we make the smallest mistake, he threatens to fire us." Yesterday, Sarah was crying in the break room. He humiliated her in front of everyone. The kitchen staff member let out a defeated sigh. "I know. But what choice do we have? He says if we complain, he'll blacklist us. No one will hire us in this industry." Jacob's grip on his coffee cup tightened until his knuckles turned white. His blood boiled at the realization, this wasn't just mismanagement. It was abuse. These employees, his employees, were being manipulated and mistreated by someone he had entrusted with leadership. The thought made his stomach churn with anger. Taking a steady breath, he pushed back his chair and stood up, his towering frame casting a shadow over the counter as he approached Rick. The manager barely spared him a glance, too preoccupied with berating another waitress over a minor mistake. "What do you want?" Rick asked gruffly, assuming Jacob was just another customer. Jacob removed his cap slowly, his piercing gaze locking onto Rick's. The air around them seemed to shift. The staff nearby froze, their eyes darting between the two men, realization dawning on their faces. Megan gasped softly, covering her mouth as she recognized him. "I want to know why my employees are afraid to speak up," Jacob said, his voice low and dangerously calm. "And I want to know right now." Rick's face paled. His confident posture faltered as he realized who was standing before him. Jacob took a step closer, his voice unwavering. "You've been abusing your authority, haven't you? Threatening, overworking, and mistreating the very people who keep this place running." He let the words hang in the air, letting the weight of his anger settle over Rick like a storm about to break. I don't know what you're talking about," Rick stammered, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. Jacob's patience was gone. "You're done here." His words were final, cold, and absolute. "Pack your things and get out." The entire restaurant fell silent. The employees exchanged stunned glances, disbelief giving way to relief. Megan's eyes shimmered, her lips parting slightly as if she couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. Rick swallowed hard, looking around for support, but found none. His reign of intimidation was over. Jacob turned to the employees, his expression softening. "If anyone else has been mistreated, I want to hear it. This place should be a team, not a prison. A hesitant murmur of agreement rippled through the staff. For the first time in a long while, they felt hope. Jacob Reed had come undercover seeking the truth. Now, he was going to fix what had been broken, and he would make sure nothing like this ever happened again. Jacob Reed stood at the entrance of the restaurant, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room, locking onto the man who had been a source of fear and misery for his employees, Rick. The normally bustling establishment had fallen into an eerie silence, tension thick in the air. The staff, usually occupied with customers, had paused their work, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of anxiety and hope. They had suffered in silence for too long. Now, the moment of reckoning had arrived. Rick leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his chest, exuding the same arrogance he always carried. He smirked as Jacob approached. "So, the CEO finally decides to make an appearance," he scoffed, feigning amusement. "What's the occasion? Thought you'd come and play hero for a day?" Jacob didn't react to the provocation. Instead, he stopped a few feet away, his posture controlled, his face unreadable. But beneath that calm exterior, his blood boiled. He had spent weeks undercover, witnessing firsthand the mistreatment his employees had endured, long hours with no breaks, wages withheld over petty excuses, and threats that kept them too afraid to speak up. And Rick, his so-called trusted manager, had been the one pulling the strings. Jacob exhaled slowly, suppressing the urge to lash out. He had to handle this strategically. "I came here to see things for myself," he said, his voice even, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "And what I found disgusted me." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, come on, Jacob. You don't actually believe everything they told you, do you? Employees always complain, it's what they do. If I ran this place the way they wanted, we'd be out of business in a month." A flicker of movement caught Jacob's eye, one of the waitresses, barely out of her teens, clutching her apron with white-knuckled hands. A dishwasher standing near the kitchen door swallowed hard, looking like he wanted to disappear. These weren't just exaggerated complaints. These were people who had been living in fear under Rick's rule. Jacob took another step forward, his presence imposing. "I don't need to believe what they told me, Rick. I saw it with my own eyes. I saw you forcing them to work overtime without pay. I saw you tearing into them over minor mistakes, threatening their jobs for things that weren't even their fault. I watched as you humiliated them in front of customers just to stroke your own ego." His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "And I saw the fear in their eyes every time you walked into the room." Rick's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he forced it back. "You're overreacting," he muttered, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "I run a tight ship, that's all. Someone has to keep them in line." Jacob clenched his jaw, his patience wearing thin. "Keeping them in line," he repeated, his voice now carrying a cold fury. "That's what you call it? No, Rick. What you've been doing is abuse. And it ends today." Rick straightened, his smirk now fully gone. "You think you can just fire me? I've been here for years, Jacob. I know this business inside and out. You need me." Jacob didn't hesitate. "What I need is leadership, not a dictator. You've done nothing but create a toxic environment that's driving my employees into the ground. You're not indispensable, Rick. You're replaceable. And as of this moment, you're fired." A murmur spread through the staff, disbelief and cautious optimism flickering in their expressions. No one had ever dared to stand up to Rick before, until now. Rick's face twisted in rage. "You'll regret this," he spat. "You think they respect you? The moment you're gone, they'll turn on you too." Jacob didn't flinch. "Respect isn't something you demand through fear. It's something you earn through integrity. And that's what I intend to rebuild here." Rick opened his mouth to argue, but something in Jacob's unwavering stare told him it was useless. His reign was over. With a final glare, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the office, likely to clear out his things. A door slammed shut behind him. Silence hung in the air for a long moment. Then, slowly, one of the employees, a young man from the kitchen, took a cautious step forward. Is he really gone? Jacob nodded. He's gone. And he's not coming back. Relief rippled through the group. Some exchanged stunned glances, others let out shaky breaths. And then, almost as if a weight had been lifted, quiet murmurs of gratitude began to spread. Jacob looked at each of them, his expression softening. I know things have been hard, he said, his voice sincere. But that changes now. If you have concerns, I want to hear them. If there's something you need, we'll find a way to make it happen. This restaurant is nothing without its people. And I promise you, you will never have to work in fear again. For the first time in a long while, the restaurant felt lighter. The storm had passed. And in its place, a new beginning had taken root. Jacob Reed stood in the center of the restaurant, his usually calm demeanor replaced by an unshakable resolve. The air was charged with a tension so thick it felt suffocating. Employees, who had long been forced into silent submission under Rick's oppressive rule, stole nervous glances at one another. Was this really happening? Could their nightmare finally be coming to an end? Rick, the longtime manager who had thrived on intimidation and fear, leaned casually against the counter with his arms crossed. A smug smirk curled at the edges of his lips as he looked Jacob up and down. So, what's this all about, boss? He asked, his voice dripping with mock amusement. Calling a staff meeting just for me? Jacob inhaled deeply, keeping his emotions in check. He had spent weeks undercover, working alongside the staff, witnessing the relentless cruelty Rick had inflicted upon them. The way he berated employees in front of customers. The way he forced them into unpaid overtime with the threat of termination looming over their heads. The way they flinched at the sound of his voice, afraid of what punishment he might dole out next. Not anymore. I wanted to address a problem, Jacob said, his voice even but firm. A problem that's been poisoning this place for far too long. Rick chuckled under his breath. Oh yeah? And what problem is that? Jacob took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Rick's. You. The word landed like a hammer, sending a ripple of shock through the room. Some employees sucked in a breath. Others exchanged uncertain glances, as if afraid to believe what they were hearing. Rick's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he scoffed, shaking his head. You've got some nerve, he muttered. I've been running this place for years. You think you can just waltz in here in? I don't think, Rick. I know. Jacob cut him off, his voice as unyielding as steel. You've created a workplace built on fear and abuse. You've disrespected and mistreated the very people who keep this restaurant running. I've seen it with my own eyes. And as of this moment, it ends. Rick's expression hardened. His usual arrogance flickered with something else, something dangerously close to uncertainty. You don't have the guts to fire me, he spat. You wouldn't even know how to run this place without me. Jacob's gaze didn't waver. You're fired, Rick. Effective immediately. A stunned silence filled the room. The employees stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Rick, however, was not the type to go down quietly. His face twisted with rage as he took a step forward, jabbing a finger in Jacob's direction. You have no idea what you're doing, he snarled. These people? They're weak. They need someone like me to keep them in line. Without me, this place will fall apart. Jacob didn't flinch. Instead, he turned, gesturing toward the staff, the same people Rick had belittled and bullied for years. They are not weak, he said, his voice filled with conviction. They are hard-working. They are dedicated. And they deserve to work in a place where they are respected, not terrified. Rick clenched his fists at his sides, his nostrils flaring. For a moment, it seemed like he might argue further, might lash out in one final display of dominance. But as he looked around the room, he saw something he hadn't expected. The fear was fading. The employees, once too scared to look him in the eye, were now standing taller. Some nodded. Some straightened their shoulders. And some, for the first time, looked at him not with fear, but with defiance. Rick scoffed, shaking his head in disgust. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "Don't come crying to me when this place crumbles without me." Jacob held his ground. "This place will be better without you." With a final glare, Rick turned on his heel and stormed toward the office to collect his things. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the restaurant like the closing of a chapter. A heavy silence followed. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then, from somewhere in the back, a small voice hesitantly asked, Is he really gone?" Jacob turned to face the employees, his expression softening. "Yes," he said. "And he's not coming back." A collective exhale rippled through the group. The tension that had held them in its grip for so long finally started to ease. A few employees exchanged quiet words of relief. Others simply stood there, as if trying to process the fact that the man who had tormented them for years was no longer in power. Jacob stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with promise. "I know things have been difficult," he said. "I know many of you have been afraid to speak up, to ask for what you deserve. That ends today. From now on, this will be a workplace where every single person is valued. Your voices matter. Your work matters. And I promise you, things will change." The employees looked at one another, a flicker of something unfamiliar in their eyes. Hope. For the first time in a long time, they believed that maybe, just maybe, the future would be different. After the chaos of the past few days, Jacob finally had a chance to sit down with Megan and Connor. The three of them gathered at a quiet corner of a nearby cafe, away from the lingering tension that still hung over the company. Though Rick was gone, the damage he had left behind wouldn't disappear overnight. The employees were still anxious, unsure of what the future held. Jacob knew that trust had been broken for too long, and if he wanted to fix it, he had to start somewhere. Megan sat across from him, her fingers absent-mindedly twisting a strand of her auburn hair, something she always did when she was deep in thought. Her usual confidence was tinged with uncertainty tonight, her posture slightly tense. Connor, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his sharp eyes watching Jacob carefully. He had always been more reserved, but there was something different in his gaze now, an unspoken challenge, as if he was waiting to see if Jacob would prove himself or fail like every other boss before him. Jacob let out a slow breath before speaking. "I wanted to check in with both of you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I know the past few days have been intense. A lot has changed, and I don't expect anyone to just move on like nothing happened." Megan scoffed, shaking her head. "Intense is an understatement," she muttered, crossing her arms. "Rick being gone is a huge relief, but let's be honest, this company has been a mess for a long time. One bad manager leaving doesn't erase everything." Connor gave a slow nod. "She's right," he said, his voice quieter but just as firm. "People are relieved, yeah. But they're also nervous. Rick may have been a nightmare, but he kept things running in his own way. Now, people don't know what to expect." His gaze locked onto Jacob's. "What exactly is your plan?" Jacob leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table, choosing his words carefully. "My plan is to rebuild. To fix what Rick and the old system destroyed. I want this to be a place where people feel valued, where they don't have to come in every day dreading what's going to happen next." He met their gazes, determined. "But I know saying that isn't enough. It's easy to promise change, actually making it happen is what matters." Megan exhaled slowly, studying him. "People are tired of empty promises," she said. "They've heard managers talk big before. No offense, Jacob, but what makes you different?" Jacob nodded, accepting the skepticism. "I get it. And you're right to question me. But I'm not here to talk, I'm here to prove it." His expression hardened with resolve. "No more intimidation, no more toxicity. I'll start by listening, to you, to everyone. And I'll take real action to fix what's broken. I just need you to give me that chance." There was a long pause. Megan glanced at Connor, who seemed to be weighing Jacob's words carefully. Finally, Connor leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said slowly. "We'll see if you're serious. But if things don't change..." "They will," Jacob interrupted, his voice steady. "I promise." Megan studied him for a moment longer, then, for the first time that night, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jacob stood at the head of the conference room, his hands resting on the polished wooden table. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like an invisible force. Around the room, dozens of employees sat, their faces a mix of exhaustion, skepticism, and cautious hope. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment he had promised. But words alone wouldn't be enough. He had to prove that real change was coming. Taking a slow breath, he steadied himself before speaking. "I know that trust has been broken," he began, his voice calm but unwavering. "I know that many of you have suffered under poor leadership, under a system that valued profits over people. That is not the company I want to lead. That is not the company we will be moving forward." Megan, standing near the back, arms crossed, watched him intently. Her sharp eyes studied his every move, every word, as if searching for cracks in his sincerity. She had been through too much, seen too many false promises, to believe in change easily. Beside her, Connor sat stiffly, his fingers tapping against the table. He had always been a fighter, a man who stood up for his colleagues, but he had also learned that sometimes, fighting wasn't enough. Jacob looked around the room, meeting their eyes one by one. Rick's toxic management is gone. His intimidation tactics, his abuse of power, they have no place here anymore. But replacing one person isn't enough. We need to change the foundation of this company, the way we work, the way we treat each other. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some employees leaned forward, intrigued. Others remained still, their expressions unreadable. "I'm not here to make empty promises," Jacob continued, his voice gaining strength. "Starting today, we're implementing real structural changes. Salaries and benefits will be reevaluated to reflect the true value of your work. Departmental oversight will increase, ensuring fair treatment across all levels. Most importantly, an anonymous feedback system will be introduced, giving each of you a voice without fear of retaliation." The room remained silent, but the energy had shifted. A woman from accounting, her brow furrowed, raised her hand hesitantly. "And what happens if nothing changes?" "We've heard speeches like this before." Jacob nodded, acknowledging the doubt. "I don't expect blind trust," he admitted. "I expect to earn it. That's why this isn't just my responsibility, it's ours. I want you to hold me accountable. I want you to see, firsthand, that this company is no longer a place of fear, but a place of growth, respect, and opportunity." Megan exhaled, unfolding her arms just slightly. Connor exchanged a glance with her before shifting in his seat, the smallest hint of curiosity breaking through his hardened exterior. They weren't convinced yet, but they were listening. Jacob knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But as he stood there, facing the people whose trust he needed to rebuild, he felt something stir, a resolve stronger than ever before. This wasn't just about restructuring. This was about redemption. And he was ready to fight for it. Jacob stood in the middle of the abandoned restaurant, his gaze sweeping across the once vibrant space now cloaked in dust and silence. The air smelled of stale grease and neglect, a far cry from the rich aromas of freshly prepared meals that had once filled the room. The dim lighting cast long shadows on the cracked tiles, and the flickering neon sign outside barely clung to life. Yet, despite the state of decay, Jacob saw potential. This place had once been a hub of warmth, laughter, and community, a place where families gathered, where celebrations were held, and where people left with full stomachs and happy hearts. He clenched his fists, determination burning in his chest. He would bring it back to life. Behind him, Megan and Connor stood quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. Megan, ever the practical one, sighed, crossing her arms as she scanned the damage. "This is a disaster," she muttered. We'll need months just to make it presentable, not to mention the costs. Are you sure about this, Jacob? Connor, more optimistic, let out a low whistle as he kicked a loose tile. Come on, Megan, it's not that bad, he said with a smirk. With the right plan, some grit, and a lot of late nights, we can turn this place around. We've done harder things. Jacob turned to them, his expression serious yet resolute. This isn't just about reopening a restaurant, he said firmly. It's about giving people their livelihoods back. It's about restoring what was lost because of bad leadership. If we don't do this, who will? Megan sighed again but nodded slowly. Connor grinned. Then what are we waiting for? The work begins. The following days were filled with sweat, exhaustion, and endless to-do lists. The restaurant had to be gutted, old furniture was removed, broken kitchen equipment was replaced, and years of grime were scrubbed away. Jacob spent hours overseeing the construction, often picking up a hammer himself to make sure things were done right. Megan worked tirelessly on logistics, calculating costs, negotiating with suppliers, and ensuring they stayed within budget. She barely had time to rest, but she never complained. Her sharp mind was the backbone of this operation. Connor, always the hands-on type, took charge of hiring and training the new staff. He reached out to former employees, those who had walked away when the previous management treated them unfairly. Some were hesitant, still bitter about their experiences. But when Jacob met with them personally, listening to their grievances, promising a better work environment, a fresh start, many agreed to return. Late at night, after the dust had settled and the day's work was done, the three of them would sit at the bar, exhausted but satisfied. We're making progress, Megan admitted one evening, sipping her coffee. It still feels impossible, but at least now I can see it. Jacob leaned back, staring at the newly painted walls, now a warm, inviting shade. It's going to be better than before, he murmured. Not just the restaurant. The way we treat people, the way we run things, it'll be different this time. Connor raised his glass of soda. To second chances, he said. Jacob and Megan clinked their glasses against his. To second chances. Opening night. The night of the grand reopening arrived faster than expected. The restaurant was transformed, soft golden lights illuminated the space, the scent of fresh herbs and sizzling dishes filled the air, and the hum of anticipation buzzed among the newly hired staff. Outside, a line had already formed. Word had spread quickly about the restaurant's revival, and people were eager to see if it could truly live up to its former glory. Jacob stood near the entrance, taking a deep breath as he watched customers step inside, their faces lighting up with surprise and delight. He could hear the clinking of glasses, the laughter of families, the murmurs of approval as the first plates were served. Megan moved efficiently through the crowd, ensuring everything ran smoothly, while Connor checked in with the staff, making sure the kitchen kept up with the flood of orders. Jacob turned to look at his team, the people who had made this possible. The chefs, the wait staff, the bartenders, each of them had taken a chance on him, trusting that this time, things would be different. And as he met their eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen before. Hope. The restaurant wasn't just back, it was reborn. And this time, it would thrive.